right? It's like maybe there's no mutual interdependence among these channels whatsoever. It's just the basic sort of structure that we'd see in interaction. Gestures doing a lot of the driving and navigational task, ho-hum, whatever. Now they do seem to be organized in some potentially theoretically interesting ways. So the first component seems to mark the giver, who is the driver of this conversation. The first component marks the giver. The second component marks acknowledgement, which is likely an extremely important aspect of this dynamic that's taking place while they're trying to find their way through the map. And then finally, the third component is this follower, who is literally a follower in the task, doesn't have the privileged information, and isn't the driver, at least to the greatest extent, of the interaction as the giver. So we sort of see in the way the components are behaving that there's some maybe potentially theoretically interesting ways in which the variance at again, this is variance at low-level channels. This is just nonverbal behavior. So the idea is that the dynamics in terms of the sort of temporal covariation of what's taking place nonverbally might mark theoretically interesting components of our interaction. So then if we change tasks, we would get some interesting other components behaving here. So I liken this to sort of, and he just slipped out, but Scott, the ICA components that we're sort of trying to isolate in something that's, you can sort of physically and spatially isolate. But here you can only, you can only sort of functionally isolate these components here. So this is sort of an abstract component that characterizes task-relevant aspects that we're trying to achieve while we're interacting. But to know whether it's not just a ho-hum finding, we need to do some other things. And so I'm going to show you the greatest preliminary results I've ever presented, ever, anywhere. So just be ready. So I'm going to knock your socks off for this. So what we can do is, okay, if gesture is driving everything, or maybe it's just nodding, gesture, and a handful of channels, then let's just redo this PCA, but let's randomly remove trios of the nonverbal stuff. So let's take out, occasionally take out gesture, occasionally take out nodding, etc. And we'll perform 1,000 of these PCAs. Of course, there are a few enough channels here. We could have just done this over all possibilities, but I was lazy, and I for looped it, so it's very shameful code. But the idea, at least, is we can look at how often these three components that I showed you, where that clustering was taking place, in these 1,000 PCAs, how many of them did these components still show statistical separation of discourse? So remember, in some of these simulations, gesture is entirely taken out. Sometimes even 2 or 3 whole channels of gesture are taken out. And so we might expect, if there's a relatively brittle ho-hum finding, you'd actually get a relatively small percentage come out across these simulations, because they have fewer of the crucial channels. And so here's the data from the simulation. So this is how many of the simulations still show significant separation in lower dimensional nonverbal space, despite the fact that we've randomly removed all trios, all possible trios. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3. Yeah. So this was really freaking surprising, and it sort of requires further investigation, because it is PCA after all. But we did this analysis, and to actually get some brittleness in this result, you have to go upwards of 6 of the 18 nonverbal channels. So it seems like there's deep, interesting covariation in the nonverbal behavior that's present, that's structuring it, even when you only have a handful of channels. Yeah?
What's the total number of nonverbal channels?
There are 18, 9 for you, 9 for me. Yeah. It was just the stuff that was below the discourse nodes in the network. I probably went through it a little quick. But the idea here is that this covariant structure across multiple modalities, so what's happening is we're actually achieving a lower dimensional performance amidst interaction among a large number of components that define human linguistic interaction. That the same patterns of sort of self-organization and control that you might see in motor control may be holding these high-level, more abstract units of measure as well. So when you and I are interacting, we're constraining each other's degrees of freedom into this synergy that's specifically adapted to the task context. And where these components that pop out aren't spatio-temporal components present in the brain, but they're functional, sort of task-relevant components in the linguistic theoretical context. So, so I've showed you, hopefully slightly convincingly at least, that there's mutual interdependence across a wide variety of channels. There's systematic temporal structuring, and we can see these echoes of potentially low-dimensional performance in these dyadic systems while they're interacting. So this does have potential theoretical implications, I think, and I'm not going to be able to answer any such questions, but just because this is a language dynamics talk. We can talk about the psycholinguistic literature and the interpersonal interaction literature, and we find that in this sort of relatively black box characterization of what's going on during human linguistic interaction, all of these kinds of processes have been identified. And some of you are probably familiar or even done some of this work and have maybe struggled to come up with the right terminology for what you're describing. So, contagion, entrainment, mirroring, synchrony, imitation, accommodation, coordination, alignment, mimicry, coupling, priming. Can you think of some others?
Grooving.
Grooving. Yeah. There are a large number of them. So Alexandra Paxton, a student at UC Merced, she's actually building a sort of a database of all these terms and the literatures they tend to occur in to determine whether what's really going on in this kind of context is a potential dynamic process of dimensionality reduction through mutual interaction among the components that define this sort of linguistic process. And so hopefully the idea would be that we might be able to identify some sort of function. I don't know how we do this in a high-level linguistic case, but to be able to develop some formal assumptions about how different channels are operating with each other, and then potentially infers different kinds of patterns that are typically associated with literatures as specific parameters of this kind of self-organization. So that would be the idea. I mean, one possible way of identifying this function, of course, that I thought after reading some music literature. Now, I didn't have any time to go through the music stuff, but I know I have 7 minutes and I will be right on time. It will be exhilarating. Yeah. Then I'll leave this muffin right here. So somebody ask a long question first while I eat my muffin.
Okay.
So, wait.
You want me to?
No, wait, hold on, here we go.
All right,
Okay. So what is that function that's governing interaction that might be taking place in the linguistic case too? So I actually do have some slides from musical interaction I wanted to present from Kawase's work and Peter Keller's work and Carolyn Palmer's work on studying the dynamics of dual performance. And of course, I think this is the Keller and Appel paper in 2010. It's really nice, studying the dynamics of two people they previously learned a piece, and they come into the lab and they play this piece together on a MIDI keyboard. You look at things like, well, you guys, everyone in the room knows this stuff, the key press asynchrony and so on. And they correlate in a variety of interesting ways, body sway coordination and other multiple modalities during musical performance. And Keller has identified potential mechanisms that might actually be crucial to our understanding of linguistic coordination as well. So when we're talking with each other and deciding words to choose, topics to flow through, we may need to engage in kinds of anticipatory imagery. I'm trying to predict the things that you know and might say during interaction, what might be interesting to you, have some fun during conversation. And so this process of anticipatory imagery that's described by Keller in music is likely included as a fundamental process in language. And in fact, Pickling and Garrett, in an intriguing BBS paper recently, have argued for Wolpert-style forward models for accomplishing this. So again, a connection to motor control as well. This idea of integrative attention while we're talking, so a specific process of following the specific aspects of the interaction that are relevant to the kind of coordination that's taking place. And then importantly, adaptive timing. And so in order for us to play this piano duo, we have to potentially make shifts in tempo as relevant to the piece. And so there's this great paper recently, very, very recently, by Kawase in Japan that actually suggested that during pieces that are relatively under-practiced relative to the original 2010 Keller paper, when you have relatively under-practiced pieces, the pianists actually use the visual modality to help coordinate each other's behavior during tempo changes. And in fact, when you shield that visual modality from them, key press asynchronies go up quite radically. So I actually have that data slide, but I'm going to skip it. But the idea is that there's this adaptive timing that's taking place between us, which may have the properties of Bruno Rep's model of, periodic correction or phase correction and so on. So there's this adaptive timing that might take place in interaction as well. And in fact, there's great evidence of this timing adaptation in linguistic interaction. So this is a Stivers-Allen paper in PNAS. Who's seen this paper? I assume you've seen this great turn-taking paper. In 2010, they studied 10 different languages and different cultures, and they collected some data of face-to-face interaction, and they coded at a millisecond level the turn transitions with an eye for whether there's consistent turn transitions or timing of turns across cultures. And so it's actually quite a compelling figure from their paper. So along the abscissa, if you prefer, is the time at which the turn was shifted. So if it's negative on this side, that means that I started talking before you finished. And then if it's over here, then it's in the positive, I waited for you to finish talking before I kicked in. And then here it's just a percentage of relative times over that turn taking. So here are the 10 languages. So this is very consistent structure, with most of the turn transitions taking place between 0 and 200 milliseconds. And the subtle cultural changes are interesting. So Danish actually has the highest average turn taking time. But by and large, the distributional properties of these suggest that human linguistic coordination involves quite a bit of this adaptive timing that may be relevant for us to understand. You get the point. So I'm at the end here. So I've used very simple kinds of techniques in time series extracted either automatically with the eye tracking and hand coding in the discourse case, and using flexible analytic methods to quantify dynamics. And I think the large-scale multimodal corpus analysis does suggest that there's a lot of richness in the multiple processes that underlie language and the way that it might be structured in time. And so there's no way in which what I've shown you suggests that, there's no solution in any of these slides, right? Okay, there's no solution to Bernstein's problem. But the idea is that there's interesting temporal structure that cascades across the components that compose human interaction in a way that really does pose a variety of really curious control questions about how the human brain is doing this simultaneously across so many channels. And I think it's one that's fundamentally more difficult than the problem of recursion. And it's one, recursion, there are all kinds of possible solutions for recursion. You can go to your favorite, you probably go to conferences devoted to specific theories of recursion, but how human linguistic levels weave together has only recently really been taking hold in some spheres. So Ray Jackendoff's Foundations of Language actually explicitly notes that this is an important problem to understand interfacing, but by and large, there are really no good stories on the horizon for how this happens in the complex case of human language. So I'm going to cut it at an hour and a half, and thank you to the collaborators and everyone else. Thanks.
There's plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Thanks for the talk. It was you have some really interesting data there, particularly with regards to multimodal information. As a cognitive neuroscientist, I was wondering if you could maybe speculate a bit about the possible neural mechanisms that subserve this. I know your data really don't speak to that, but I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, I think that. So I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist. I'm not even a social cognitive neuroscientist. And so you have to take everything I'm about to say with a massive, profit-making grain of salt. I think that the typical approach you would take in many of these interactive studies is you would typically choose a channel that you're interested in. So for example, looking for sort of excursions from expected co-articulation and whether you get certain kinds of ERP components or signals that might reflect, for example, error correction. So you might see anterior cingulate that might come up during error correction or something. So you can identify these potential ERP components or regions of the brain that seem to be associated with specific aspects of the interaction. But I think what you're asking really is what's the network of multimodal interaction? How are they?
Mechanism would be the word I would use.
Yeah. And so I think that there is there's really interesting work that I've found to be just pretty inspiring and taking kind of a similar approach that I think is finding its way in a wide variety of domains in cognitive neuroscience, just neuroscience generally. And that is that this sort of the phrenology assumption of many of the ways that we analyze our data, even though no one would say that they're a phrenologist. No one would say that, right? But the idea is that the way that a lot of these analytic techniques are used is under the assumption that we're sort of isolating specific functional structures that can be given unique functional characterizations and so on. And now there's sort of a movement to try to highlight and emphasize the network structure of brain function instead, of course, F-sporins, et cetera. Bullmore and so on. But the work that I just really liked recently is a philosopher who also doubles as a computer scientist, Mike Anderson, who's at Franklin Marshall.
Yeah.
And he's built his own fMRI database, which has in it fMRI data from a whole suite of tasks, including language tasks. And what he's done is really he's used a semantic model and looked at the activation patterns in the fMRI data, and he's identified dispositional patterns of different brain areas. And so you might see sort of, Broca's area is not just syntax, but also auditory or motor sequencing and so on. And so what he's done is he's seeing brain areas as exhibiting these kinds of behavioral dispositions that he's statistically extracted. But then what he does is he sort of inverses that and then takes the cognitive processes themselves, looks across the behavioral dispositions, and can identify what the network of language is. And he has an explicit theory for what he should find. He argues that evolutionarily more recent functions should exhibit much more broad recruitment of neural regions. For this simple, he has a simple, elegant theory of neural reuse that's motivated by other counts as well. But the idea is that a relatively modern behavioral function that we may have picked up in the past 100,000 years is unlikely to have devoted to it some special module in some specific part of the brain, but it's probably some coordinated pattern. And in fact, he finds that music and language, I think he has music in there, are two of the most broadly distributed cognitive functions. And so identifying the mechanism is hard to answer that question without, I think, just saying that it may be interesting to go in his book. He's very friendly, so I'm just going to advertise Anderson's book. After Phrenology, it's going to be out at MIT Press, it's going to be out this summer. And so he's a very interesting person, trained as a philosopher, computer scientist, and a psychologist, analyzing a large amount of data and trying to do some functional inference about the network of cognitive processing. So I think that's got to be the mechanism. It's in some way, and I think that Chris Callow and Tom Schernemann, who's an anthropologist and neuroscientist at Indiana, we just wrote a paper where we're arguing that in fact, for something as complex as music and language, it's likely that you want to have a complex multimodal signal. It's going to have robustness in code. It's likely going to be sort of this pattern of information processing that's likely more likely to sustain a complex performance over time between two people than having a devoted module. You're more likely to have a more robust, noise-resistant system by recruiting a much wider and multi-scale range of areas. So I think that's how I would answer that question in that very long, meandering way. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, and maybe I missed this, but was during the MAP task, was there any kind of a behavioral performance measure taken?
Yeah, good question.
Okay. If so, are the people who couple with more channels tend to perform better?
Yeah. So, in general, from interaction 1 to 8, people show more behavioral coupling over time. So they get more coupled in most of the channels, actually. So the majority of the channels, not all of them, but a majority of them. And some of them are very statistically weak, so the idea is it's a lot of channels. So in terms of just the strengthening of their rapport and their task performance, just as a function of time, you see that increase. But we also have performance time and errors. So we have the number of errors that they produce during any given trial. And interestingly, recurrence or coordination correlates positively with errors. Yeah. And so the idea, of course, is that they're trying the story. And it requires, so we haven't published any of these sorts of ground truth performance measures yet, but in order to know whether the coordination is serving a specific kind of role that I'm going to describe now, we have to do some further analysis. But the idea is, as they're making mistakes, they're trying to compensate by coordinating with each other even more. So it's kind of the unintuitive prediction, but as you're making mistakes, you're trying to find some sort of common code for you to perform the task efficiently. And so there are other data that actually suggest that this would hold. So I haven't cut so much out. You probably didn't see how the amazing jumps I made in the slides here. But there was other data suggesting that this coupling pattern actually does have compensatory function. So in another experiment that's a great, awesome experiment Daniel Richardson designed, he's amazing, to try to look at how belief in how difficult a task is going to be essentially affects coordination. And so that's how I'm going to describe the task. But the idea is if I give subjects the impression that it's going to be harder for you to do the task, even though all the tasks are equivalently difficult, people will actually show higher coupling in their eye movements. So they're sort of more tightly entrained to each other if they think there's going to be some percent difficulty to them. So I think that there may be some interesting, unintuitive sort of different relationships among these performance measures. Yeah, Peter, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'll
Yes.
ask a long question so you can chew on it.
Okay.
Muffin that is. So you started out by sort of laying out this framework of looking at interactions or coupling of channels across time scales. But then some of the time scale stuff wasn't really emphasized later on. And I'm just wondering whether in these recurrence plots it's fair or reasonable or accurate to think of the width of those peaks in the profiles as the characteristic time scale of the process. And then if so, you know, when you look at the cross-channel recurrence types of things, or, you know, if you've looked at that in detail, if there's something.
Yeah. Actually, so I'll just answer that question in two ways. One, just noting that indeed in these recurrence plots, there are all kinds of measures you can extract to get a sense of the nature of the coordination, how disordered it is, and so on. So it's a whole suite of techniques. We're using it in a way that aligns with cross-correlation type of methods. But you can, for example, extract the average length of a vertical or diagonal structure. You can also look at the histogram of those line lengths. So with the average length, you'll get a sense of the typical timescale at which, for example, smiling is taking place. What's nice about this is that it's the technique with recurrence just automatic. You get that automatically from the plot. So it takes all horizontal or vertical lines or diagonal structures, and it can calculate the average length simultaneously across all possible lags or comparisons. So it's a very elegant way of looking at all lags simultaneously.